This is lecture number 17, Sectionalism between North and South between 1844 and 1860. We're going to review the most significant events leading to the American Civil War. We've already kind of been laying the groundwork, the issue of slavery, and not so much the morality, because abolitionism is growing, but that's not the majority of the public sentiment. But the main issue has been the extension of slavery. Slavery in new territories. This is the issue. America had just won the Mexican War and had this new territory in the West. That's what we refer to as Mexican cession, the new territory acquired from the Mexican War. And again, how that created a dilemma, whether they would practice slavery in these new territories. A popular solution to this dilemma was the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that let the people that live in those territories decide. Let those people decide, let them vote whether there'll be a free or slave state. It was an issue that was brought up in the election of 1848. In fact, the Democratic nominee, one Lewis Cass, C-A-S-S, he is the one that promoted and actually coined this term, popular sovereignty. Sounds very democratic. Again, we're going to see a party like the last election, the Liberty Party, a party dedicated to prevent the spread of slavery. That would be the Free Soil Party. They're going to have a candidate, Martin Van Buren, in the election of 1848. And the Whig nominee would win, the hero of the Mexican War, Zachary Taylor. The Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor, would decide, would be president following the Mexican War. Now, it didn't take long for these new territories, for one of them to become a state, for one of them to want to become a state. California. California, remember, belonged to Mexico. And Mexico had already outlawed or banned slavery. Well, in 1848, you might remember this from elementary school, and this stamp over here to the right tells us. In 1848, they discovered gold in California. By 1849, I'm sorry, this is an error up here. By 1849, California was full of immigrants from around the country, from China, etc. It was a gold rush. That's where you get the term the 49ers, because 49 was the peak of all the immigrants coming to California in search of gold, making their riches. So as California became quickly populated, California wished to join the Union, wished to join America as an official state, but as a free state, not a slave state. They never had any need or wasn't in a culture to practice slavery. This was a dilemma because with California entering as a free state, it threatened the balance of the Senate. It would mean that free states would have more members in the Senate, as you can see over here in the pink. So this would not be something that the South would easily be convinced to support. Now, another dilemma taking place, another issue that was taking place at this time, the South was really upset that they were losing a lot of their slaves to the North. Now, the federal government had a fugitive slave law that said they could reacquire or capture their escaped slaves, their fugitive slaves, when they went to the North. And to some degree, the North had to help them. But to the South, they thought that the law was weak, that the North was not helping them. Instead, the South was very upset at the Underground Railroad that we talked about. All of these efforts to undermine slavery by Northern states. So, trying to find an answer to both of these dilemmas on both sides came Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Remember, he's done a compromise over tariffs. He did the compromise over Missouri. Well, he's going to propose one concerning California. It's called the Compromise of 1850. In the Compromise of 1850, California becomes a free state. There's no compromise to the balance in the Senate. California becomes a free state. However, the South would get a stronger fugitive slave law, at least on paper. A stronger fugitive slave law with more guarantees to acquire their escaped slaves. Compromise of 1850 also ended the slave trade in the capital, which is Washington, D.C. The slave trade, not slaves, which is something else that the North wanted to acquire out of this compromise. Now, even the North was against the Compromise of 1850. The North was upset about the fugitive slave law. They wanted to do no kind of compromise. It took the Congressman Daniel Webster to give an important speech to convince Northern congressmen to accept the Compromise of 1850. Daniel Webster made the 7th of March speech to convince Northern congressmen to vote for the Compromise of 1850. What we're going to find out truly after the Compromise of 1850, you can definitely argue that the North got the better end of this deal. Why? Because the North now has more senators with California. And when it came to this new fugitive slave law, the northern states found creative ways, loopholes. They found creative ways to not enforce the fugitive slave law. An example of that is what's called personal liberty laws. Personal liberty laws are state laws designed not to enforce the fugitive slave law. State laws that told state officials not to help capture fugitive slaves. So the results of the Compromise of 1850 were seen, very negatively by the South as a failure to the South. So here we are 10 years before the Civil War, and there's friction, there's dissension, there's divisions, very strong. Now, aside from the issue of slavery, we'll talk a little bit about foreign affairs. America will continue, again, because of industrialization, because of economic gain. Our goals will still be to expand, to extend America. And when we went across a continent, one could say that's the manifest destiny, that's expansion. But when we start going to other territories and forcing our way and acquiring land, then that becomes imperialism. So we're kind of transforming from one to another about this time by the mid-1800s. Examples of our efforts to expand: the Austin Manifesto, a secret proposal to buy Cuba from Spain. This was done by Southern congressmen because Cuba was very rich in its plantations and so forth. It never passed because the Northerners, again, were against this. The South acquiring more land or maybe representatives. But it was another example of America always looking to expand. Austin Manifesto, a secret attempt to purchase Cuba from Spain. In 1853, the American government decided we needed more land from Mexico. This was done in a purchase. In 1853, we bought additional land from Mexico. It was called the Gadsden Purchase, today's southwestern United States. This territory down here, including Yuma, the United States bought additional land from Mexico with really the purpose of making a continental railroad. We never built the continental railroad there, but that was the purpose behind the Gadsden Purchase. Again, America expanding. Now, evidence here that we're going to go beyond manifest destiny and expansion in the continent, and now go beyond our continent, was when 1853, because remember, now we have California, so now we've really opened up trade to Asia. Well, before getting to China, our trade routes would lead us through Japan. America took it upon ourselves. We needed to trade with Japan. We needed to be able to stop and have ships gain supplies and fuel at Japan. And basically, we took an approach, and Japan wouldn't have a choice. In 1853, we sent Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. And really, it was a forced negotiation, as we see right here. A forced negotiation with Japan to allow our merchant ships to trade and gain supplies in Japan. So we forced trade on Japan. Commodore Matthew Perry forced trade, forced an area where our ships can stop in their trading routes to Asia under the threat of war. So this is an example of how we're going again from expansion to imperialism. So we discussed one compromise leading up to the Civil War, and you can argue a failed compromise. And now we're going to come to another attempted compromise. Okay, this dilemma is an attempted compromise. And it deals with the Nebraska Territory. This was a territory acquired back from the Louisiana Purchase that Americans have settled in great numbers. And now they're ready to ask for statehood. Look over to the right. All of this is in the Nebraska Territory. Again, the dilemma came up. Would this be one state? Would this be one state free state? One slave state? The South was very much against the idea of another free state. So this would cause division, debate. A senator from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas had a compromise, had a proposal that would eventually pass. Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act is to use popular sovereignty. Use popular sovereignty to divide this territory. Divide the Nebraska territory. The northern part of the territory would be Nebraska, and the southern part of the territory would be Kansas. Use popular sovereignty to split the territory into, you would think, a free state of Nebraska and a slave state of Kansas. Use popular sovereignty to decide the division of this territory into two states and try to prevent any conflict. Well, remember, the one party that had the biggest issue with allowing any, and I'm talking any, new slave states was the Whig Party. So an element of them, an element of Northern Democrats. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to lead to the birth of a new political party, a permanent party. This would be the birth of the modern-day Republican Party. The members of this party would be against any territory becoming a slave state. They're totally against the expansion of slavery into new territories. As this compromise was passed, the reality of making it happen became very difficult, especially in the territory of Kansas. Nebraska, it was easy to form that into a free territory because they were not practicing any form of slavery there. However, there was slavery in Kansas. But it was the abolitionists, it was the anti-slavery people that tried to stop Kansas from becoming a slave state. We had people coming in from outside of the territory trying to stop popular sovereignty, trying to stop Kansas from becoming a slave state. For example, the New England Immigrant Aid Company was an abolitionist group that came in large numbers to stop Kansas from becoming a slave state. At the same time, you had a pro-slavery group. They were called Border Ruffians, coming from the neighboring Missouri to protect slavery. Coming from Missouri, the Border Ruffians to protect slavery. So what you had happening in Kansas was a mini civil war. It became violent. Thus, this was a period, this was a time, an area, as they tried to work out the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas was known as Bleeding Kansas. Conflict in the streets of Kansas. Some call it a preview of the American Civil War. The violence would only escalate, even to the floor of Congress. As the congressmen debated what was taking place in Kansas and who was to blame, a congressman by the name of Preston Brooks from South Carolina attacked and caned Senator Charles Sumner, a senator from Massachusetts. This is in the floor of Congress. This is how violent this issue had become. Preston Brooks, congressman from South Carolina, attacked the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. Meanwhile, surrounding Bleeding Kansas, we're going to see the resurgence of abolitionists, and abolitionists ready to use violence to promote the cause. The infamous John Brown. There's a picture of him right here. He was an abolitionist. He believed he was on a mission from God to end slavery. He carried around like a private police force, including his sons. And during the events of Bleeding Kansas, he's remembered for a massacre, being involved in a massacre in this town of Kansas in 1856. He would become really a terrible figure in the eyes of the South, a murderer. In 1857, in spite of all the violence, Kansas attempted to become a slave state. They put together a constitution in 1857. An attempt by Kansas to become a slave state in 1857. It was called the Lecompton Constitution, a state constitution that said they would practice slavery, because you need to have a state constitution to apply for statehood. But again, the people of Kansas were not united behind this constitution. If you look at this famous political cartoon on the right, you're forcing this down our throats, at least to those that were against slavery. And in the end, the federal government, Congress, never accepted Kansas as a slave state. But by 1857, the North and South, the animosity was extreme. Other events are going to add fuel to the fire that only increase this hatred for one another. By the 1850s, we're going to see anti-slavery literature, or what you would call abolitionist literature. It's having a profound impact on society. Two of the most famous books, anti-slavery literature. The author, her name was Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote the very famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in 1852. They really try to depict the life of a slave family. And the worst part, to a lot of people that read it, it showed the evil of separating slave families. This was a book that was not only popular amongst abolitionists here in America, it was also popular in Europe. And in a country like England, that the South wanted to be on their side during the Civil War, this is going to have a huge impact on the people of England and hesitating to join the war to protect slavery. Another piece of anti-slavery literature, a book written by Hinton R. Helper. The book written by Hinton R. Helper is titled The Impending Crisis of the South, written in 1857. This book by Helper was an anti-slavery book, but for economic reasons. Helper argued in his book that slavery hurt the common white man in the South, that it denied them work and economic opportunities. Well, leading up to the Civil War, both of these books were banned in the South. The election of 1856, the Democrats are going to nominate James Buchanan, and he would be one that would support, again, popular sovereignty, making an attempt not to alienate either side, the North or the South. But the situation will get worse. The situation gets worse with a famous Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott case, which happened in 1857. Here's a picture of Dred Scott. Famous Supreme Court case that just led us closer to war. On behalf of Dred Scott, who was a slave, Dred Scott was a slave whose master took him to live in the North for a period of time. And on behalf of Dred Scott, abolitionists took his case to court and said because he was taken to live in the North, above the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise, he should have been a free man because slavery was illegal beyond that border. This was an important Supreme Court case. The outcome? The Supreme Court said that Dred Scott was property. He could not sue like a citizen. He cannot go to court like a citizen. But the Dred Scott case also said, in being someone's property, there can be no border. That an American can take their property to northern states or even southern states. The Dred Scott case had a huge impact. The Dred Scott case literally nullified the Missouri Compromise. The Dred Scott case said the Missouri Compromise was no longer valid. The Dred Scott case said even popular sovereignty wasn't valid. Again, because a man is protected, according to the 14th Amendment, he can protect his property no matter where he goes. 1858. A leading candidate for the Senate, his name was Stephen Douglas, responsible for the Compromise of 1850. He's running for re-election for the state of Illinois, senator of Illinois. He's going to run against a new up-and-coming Republican by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And they're going to engage in a series of debates. Okay, Douglas is a Democrat, Lincoln is a Republican. And they're debating this whole dilemma. They're debating going forward. Is it legal? Should it be legal to continue to allow slavery in new territories? Or should we prevent slavery in new territories? Well, Douglas, during these debates, made clear his Freeport doctrine. In these debates, Douglas made clear his Freeport doctrine, which was a plan to continue popular sovereignty in spite of what the Supreme Court said. And Lincoln, while he lost the election, he became a powerful figure in the Republican Party because of his success in these debates, by really shining a light on how Douglas's plan would not work. Douglas, you're still going against the Supreme Court. In 1859, John Brown, who some consider the murderer or some consider the abolitionist leader, goes into Harper's Ferry, a federal arsenal, a place that carries weapons. He attempts to steal these weapons and start a slave insurrection. Harper's Ferry is in Virginia. He leads this raid. John Brown of Harper's Ferry in 1859 tries to arm slaves for them to start a rebellion. But Brown is captured. He is captured, he is tried, and he is executed. John Brown becomes a martyr for abolitionism. And of course, you can imagine what the South thought of where the country was going. They feared that they would have to deal with John Brown's over and over again. So you can see how the nation is truly divided and very close now to civil war. Well, the election of 1860 gave the South a reason. The Democratic Party is kind of split as to extending slavery and not. The Republican Party is united with Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, they made clear that they are against the extension of slavery in America, and they would do everything in their power to stop it. Abraham Lincoln's name did not even come out in the presidential ballots in the South. The South was so much against it. Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency in 1860. The secession begins. The secession, the breaking away begins. South Carolina is the first one to do it. Within 6 weeks, others will join them. This is the secession. This is the South breaking free. Interesting, if you look at these nations, these are technically southern nations. Southern states. They're called the border states. But they decide, after weighing whether secession is worth it, they decide to stay with the Union. Everything in the blue we would consider the Union. When the southern states secede, they decide to make their own government. They call it the Confederate States of America. They would elect their own president, one Jefferson Davis. They would create their own flag, as you can see over here to the right. And Congress made one last attempt to end the secession with the Crittenden Amendments. by a senator from Kentucky, made the member of the border state, one last attempt, a proposal, the Crittenden Amendments, uh, asking the South to reconsider the secession, proposed that the North would go back to honor the 3630, that everyone honor the 3630. It was a proposal of the 3630 and a proposal of popular sovereignty. When Abraham Lincoln came out in opposition to the Crittenden Amendments, all hopes of a reconciliation ended. So let's take a look at a couple of themes. Number one, to what extent did the compromises of the Democrats and Whigs fail to keep peace? Those compromises, the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, even though it doesn't have the word compromise, it was an attempt at compromise. Know them and what were their strengths and weaknesses, and why did they ultimately, why didn't they prevent war? Number two, to what extent did the abolitionist movement cause the Civil War? You got to go back. We talked a little bit about abolitionism here, but the lectures before it, abolitionism, what impact did they truly have in impacting the decision for America to begin the Civil War?